There are nights that people remember because of the music. And then there are nights they remember because the music never had a chance to begin. Long before anyone shed a tear, long before a forgotten letter was unfolded beneath the brightest lights in Las Vegas, long before the world witnessed the only silence louder than Elvis Presley's voice, a daughter made a promise to a dying man. She carried that promise across years of grief, thousands of miles of lonely highways, and countless nights when she almost lost the courage to finish what he had asked. She had only one mission: find Elvis, place the letter in his hands, and say nothing until he opened it. She never imagined that fulfilling her father's final wish would stop the biggest concert of the year, or that it would expose a wound neither time nor fame had ever managed to heal. Las Vegas glittered beneath the desert sky like a city built from diamonds. Every hotel shimmered, every casino echoed with laughter. The streets overflowed with expensive cars, photographers, tourists, and dreamers convinced they had arrived at the center of the world. But every road led toward one place: the International Hotel. Inside, more than 70,000 people filled every seat. The excitement was almost impossible to contain. Teenagers clutched handmade photographs. Older couples smiled as they remembered hearing Elvis on the radio years before. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, too young to understand why everyone around them looked so overwhelmed with anticipation. Some people prayed they might receive a smile. Others hoped for a handshake. Many simply wanted to say that, at least once in their lives, they had stood in the same room as the king of rock and roll. Nobody came expecting to witness a confession. Nobody came expecting to watch a ghost walk back onto the stage. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Assistants hurried through narrow hallways carrying guitars, microphones, bottles of water, spare cables, and handwritten schedules. Musicians laughed to hide their nerves. The orchestra rehearsed familiar melodies that had become part of American history. Every clock seemed to tick louder than the last. 5 minutes, 4, 3. Then, everything slowed. At the end of a quiet hallway, behind a door marked only with a simple brass star, Elvis Presley stood alone. The white jumpsuit hung perfectly across his shoulders. Its thousands of crystals sparkled beneath the dressing room lights like frozen stars. The gold belt reflected every movement. The famous cape rested beside him, untouched. To the world, he looked invincible. To the mirror, he looked tired. Not tired from concerts, not tired from travel. He looked like a man carrying a memory that refused to grow old. His fingers slowly slipped into the pocket of his jacket. They found the object without looking, a military dog tag. The chain had darkened with age. Tiny scratches covered its surface. The engraved letters had nearly disappeared after years of being held between nervous fingers. He closed his hand around it. For several seconds, he simply stood there, eyes closed, breathing quietly. As if somewhere deep inside, another version of himself still existed. A young soldier, unknown, unfamous, laughing without cameras. Someone knocked softly. 2 minutes, Elvis. He opened his eyes. The dog tag disappeared back into his pocket. So it begins, he whispered. Whether he was speaking about the concert or something else, even he did not know. The arena lights suddenly disappeared. Darkness swallowed everything. The audience erupted. The sound crashed against the walls like an ocean during a storm. Thousands of voices merged into one. "Elvis, we love you!" Come on! Flashbulbs exploded across the darkness like endless lightning. The announcer stepped forward. His voice echoed through every corner of the arena. Ladies and gentlemen, the crowd became even louder. Please welcome. A pause. Elvis Presley. The roof itself seemed to tremble. People leaped to their feet. Women cried openly. Some reached toward the stage as though simply touching the air around him would become the greatest moment of their lives. Then he appeared. Calm, elegant, smiling. The king walked slowly beneath the spotlight, every movement effortless, every wave answered by another explosion of applause. He reached the microphone, looked across the endless sea of faces, smiled one final time. The orchestra lifted their instruments. The conductor raised his baton. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. Then, Elvis! The scream tore through the arena, not like excitement, like heartbreak. Every violin stopped, every guitar fell silent. The drummer froze before striking the first beat. The conductor's hand remained suspended in the air. The entire stadium turned toward the front row. A young woman stood there. She wasn't dressed like the fans surrounding her. No glitter, no souvenirs, no excitement. Only exhaustion. The kind carried by someone who had spent years speaking to a person who could no longer answer. Her hands trembled, but her eyes never did. She looked directly at Elvis, as though the 70,000 people surrounding them no longer existed. Do you remember me? Silence. You don't, her voice cracked. But you remember my father. The crowd began murmuring. Some laughed nervously, others shouted for security. Within seconds, guards pushed through the front rows. One reached for her shoulder. She didn't resist. Instead, she said the sentence that froze the entire arena. My father died, believing you would keep your promise. The words struck Elvis harder than any scream ever could. His smile vanished, instantly, not gradually, not politely. It simply disappeared. The microphone slipped lower in his hand. His breathing changed, only slightly, but enough for those closest to notice. The guards waited. One whispered, Mr. Presley? Everyone expected the same answer. Remove her. Continue the show. Forget this ever happened. Instead, Elvis slowly lifted his eyes toward the woman. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It felt as though two people separated by decades were trying to recognize each other across time itself. Then Elvis quietly said, Please. His voice barely carried across the stage. The guard leaned closer. What was that, sir? Elvis repeated himself, louder. Let her come. The arena fell into absolute silence. Even the air felt heavier. The guards stepped aside. The woman climbed the stairs one careful step at a time. No dramatic music, no applause. Only the echo of her footsteps, each one sounding louder than the last. When she finally stood before him, she reached into her worn leather bag. Slowly, carefully, she removed a faded envelope. Its edges were cracked. Its paper had yellowed with age. The corners were soft from being held thousands of times. She looked at it for one brief moment, almost lovingly, then placed it into Elvis's trembling hands. My father protected this for more than half his life. She swallowed. When he knew he wasn't coming home. Her voice almost disappeared. He made me promise that only you could read it. Elvis stared at the envelope. His name was written across the front. Not printed, written by hand. He recognized the handwriting before he recognized the memory. His heartbeat quickened. His fingers hesitated over the seal. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Very gently, he unfolded the brittle paper. Before he could reach the letter inside, a photograph slipped free. It drifted through the spotlight, spinning slowly, before landing at his feet. One of the cameras zoomed in, the giant screens filled with the image. A much younger Elvis. No fame, no spotlight, no white suit. Just an ordinary soldier laughing with another young man in military uniform. The stranger's arm rested across Elvis's shoulder. They looked less like friends and more like brothers. A quiet gasp spread across the audience. No one recognized the other soldier, but Elvis did. The blood drained from his face. The years disappeared from his eyes. For one impossible instant, the king of rock and roll was gone. Standing there instead was a frightened young soldier, haunted by a promise he had never believed would return. A single tear escaped before he even realized he was crying. It struck the old photograph. The woman watched silently. "I told my father," she whispered, "that you would never remember." Another tear fell. But he smiled. She looked toward the audience, then back at Elvis. "He said," her voice broke, "tell him I never forgot the day he tried to save me." The arena became so silent that the soft flutter of the letter unfolding inside Elvis's shaking hands sounded like thunder. And somewhere beneath the blinding lights, beneath the fame, beneath the legend, a story buried for decades finally took its first breath. For several endless seconds, Elvis could not breathe. The roaring arena had disappeared. The bright lights above the stage faded into darkness. The faces of 70,000 people became nothing more than distant shadows. Only the photograph remained. Only one face. Daniel. He had not spoken that name aloud in more than a decade. Yet the moment his eyes met the faded photograph, every memory came rushing back with merciless clarity. Germany. Cold rain, gray skies, the smell of wet earth, rows of military barracks stretching farther than the eye could see. The young Elvis Presley had arrived carrying little more than a duffel bag and a guitar. Nobody cared who he had been back in America. Inside the army, fame disappeared. Everyone wore the same uniform, everyone woke before sunrise, everyone marched, everyone obeyed. The first weeks were lonely. The cheers of thousands had been replaced by silence. Concert halls had become muddy training fields. Bright spotlights had become harsh winter mornings. Many soldiers treated him like a celebrity. Others wanted nothing to do with him. But one man never looked at Elvis like a star. His name was Daniel Carter. He extended his hand on Elvis's very first morning. "You look like someone who's forgotten how to be ordinary." Elvis laughed. "And you look like someone who enjoys saying dangerous things." Daniel smiled. "Maybe that's why we'll get along." From that moment, they became inseparable. If Elvis stayed late cleaning equipment, Daniel stayed. If Daniel received extra duty, Elvis volunteered to help. If one was punished, The other usually wasn't far behind. Their commanding officers often joked they shared the same shadow. The friendship confused everyone. One man came from unimaginable fame. The other came from a forgotten farming town that barely appeared on maps. Yet neither cared. Around each other, they were simply two young men trying to survive adulthood before they understood life. Late at night, after training ended, they would sneak behind the maintenance garages carrying an old guitar that had somehow survived the journey across the Atlantic. Daniel always requested the same song. "Play the one about going home." Elvis would laugh. "You always pick the sad ones." "They're honest." Then Elvis would play quietly while Daniel stared into the stars. One evening, Daniel finally admitted why. "My daughter loves music." Elvis looked up. "You have a daughter?" Daniel reached into his wallet. Inside was a tiny black and white photograph. A little girl, barely 3 years old, curly hair, a crooked smile, holding a stuffed rabbit almost bigger than herself. "Her name is Emily." Daniel smiled with a pride that words could never fully describe. "I've missed more birthdays than I can count." Elvis studied the picture. "She's beautiful." Daniel nodded. "Promise me something." Elvis chuckled. "We've only known each other a few months." "I know." "And you're already asking for promises?" Daniel's smile slowly faded. "I'm serious." Something in his voice changed. The joking disappeared. "If anything ever happens to me..." Elvis immediately interrupted him. "Don't." "No," Daniel insisted. "Listen. If I don't come home..." "I will." "You don't know that." Silence settled between them. The cold wind whispered through the trees. Daniel folded the photograph carefully before placing it back inside his wallet. "I don't want money. I don't want fame. I don't even want people to remember my name." He looked directly into Elvis's eyes. "I just don't want my little girl growing up believing her father forgot her." Elvis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly held out his hand. "A promise." Daniel gripped it tightly. Neither man realized that promise would survive longer than either of them ever imagined. Back in the present, the arena remained completely silent. Elvis continued reading the fragile letter. Every line pulled him deeper into memories he had spent years trying to bury. The young woman waited patiently. She wasn't angry anymore. She simply watched the expression on his face. She had seen the same look before, years earlier, on her father's face. One of the musicians quietly lowered his guitar onto the stage floor. Nobody dared interrupt. Even the photographers had stopped taking pictures. Somehow, everyone instinctively understood this moment belonged to someone else. Elvis reached the middle of the letter. His lips trembled as he silently read the words. "If this letter ever reaches you, then somehow life has given us one final conversation." His breathing became uneven. The paper shook in his hands. "You spent years blaming yourself for something that was never yours to carry." A tear slid slowly down Elvis's cheek. The audience watched in complete silence. The woman finally spoke. "My father never stopped talking about you." Elvis slowly lifted his head. "He said you were the only man who tried to change what happened." The words struck harder than applause ever could. Elvis whispered, "I wasn't strong enough." She gently shook her head. He never believed that. Another long silence followed. Then she reached into her bag once more. There was one thing he never let anyone touch. From inside, she carefully removed an old leather wallet. Its edges were cracked from age. Its stitching had nearly come apart. She opened it. Inside, protected behind faded plastic, was the same photograph of a little girl Elvis had once held beneath the cold German sky. Only now, that little girl stood before him as a grown woman. Emily, Daniel's daughter. Elvis stared at her. His eyes widened with disbelief. "You," his voice barely escaped. "You're Emily." She smiled sadly. "My father always believed you would recognize me." Another tear escaped Elvis's eyes. "I should have found you." Emily gently shook her head. "You tried." His face filled with confusion. "What do you mean?" She reached for the final page of the letter. "The answer," she whispered, "is here." Elvis slowly turned the page. At the very bottom, beneath decades-old handwriting, one final sentence waited. He hadn't read it yet. His fingers froze before reaching the last line. Because deep inside, he already knew. Whatever those final words were, nothing about this night would ever be the same again. And somewhere beyond the blinding stage lights, 70,000 strangers sat in perfect silence, waiting for a promise made by two young soldiers many years ago to finally reveal its true cost. The paper trembled between Elvis's fingers. Not because he was old, not because the lights were too bright, but because every heartbeat carried him closer to a truth he had spent years trying to outrun. The arena remained impossibly still. More than 70,000 people sat without speaking. Nobody reached for the exits. Nobody checked a watch. Nobody cared that the concert had never truly begun. For the first time in years, the world wasn't waiting for Elvis Presley to sing. It was waiting for him to finish a story. He slowly lowered his eyes to the final line. His lips moved almost silently. Then he read it. "If you are reading this, it means I was wrong. I believed I would make it home. Since I did not, promise me one last thing. Stop carrying my life like it was your failure. It never was." Elvis closed his eyes. Another tear slipped down his face. Then another, and another. He folded the letter carefully, pressing it against his chest as though he could somehow embrace the man who had written it decades earlier. The audience watched in complete silence. Emily spoke softly. "My father wrote that letter the night before his final mission." Elvis looked at her. "He told my mother that if he didn't return, I should never grow up hating anyone." She smiled through tears. "But children don't always understand promises." She looked down at the old photograph. "When I was little, I believed you had forgotten him." Her voice faltered. "I asked my mother why you never came." Elvis whispered, "I did." Emily slowly nodded. "I know." She reached into her bag one final time. This time, she removed a small bundle of worn envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. There were dozens. Elvis stared at them in confusion. My father never stopped writing to you. She gently untied the ribbon. But these... She looked at the audience before returning her eyes to Elvis. Aren't from him. She handed him the stack. They're from you. Elvis frowned. I don't understand. My mother kept every letter you ever sent. His breathing caught. Emily continued. You wrote after the funeral. You wrote every Christmas. You wrote every birthday. You offered to help us more times than I can count. She smiled sadly. My mother accepted your kindness, but she never wanted me to grow up believing I owed my future to a famous man. Elvis lowered his head. I respected her wish. You did, Emily nodded. You never stopped trying. She gently touched the stack of letters. I didn't read them until after she passed away. She laughed softly through her tears. I spent half my life believing a stranger had abandoned my father. Another pause. Then I discovered that stranger had quietly spent half his life trying to keep a promise. A wave of emotion swept through the arena. People who had arrived expecting music now found themselves wiping away tears. The orchestra remained motionless. Several musicians quietly bowed their heads. Even members of the security team struggled to hide their emotions. Elvis looked toward the ceiling. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he spoke. There wasn't a single year. His voice cracked. When I didn't wonder if I could have done something differently. He looked back at Emily. The night before that mission, your father couldn't sleep. A faint smile crossed his face. So we sat outside the barracks. The memory returned with perfect clarity. Daniel had laughed. If one day the whole world knows your name, he had looked at Elvis with that same familiar grin. Don't let them make you forget the people who knew you before the applause. Elvis had laughed back, as if anyone could ever forget you. Daniel had answered quietly, No. Promise me you'll remember who you were. The memory vanished. Elvis looked at Emily. I kept the dog tag. Slowly, he reached into his pocket. The silver chain caught the light. Time had scarred it, years had darkened the metal, but the name engraved upon it remained. Daniel Carter. A collective gasp echoed across the arena. I carried this, Elvis whispered, to every concert. Emily covered her mouth. You still have it? I couldn't leave him behind twice. Those words broke something inside the audience. People openly wept. There was no embarrassment, no hesitation, only shared humanity. Emily stepped closer. My father knew. Elvis looked at her. How? The last thing he told my mother was... She fought back tears. If Elvis ever blames himself, tell him I already forgave him before anything happened. Silence. The kind that could never be created by microphones. The kind born only from truth. Emily slowly opened her arms. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Elvis stepped forward. They embraced. Not as a celebrity and a stranger, not as a legend and a fan, but as two people carrying the same grief for far too many years. The applause began somewhere in the upper rows. One person, then another, then hundreds. then thousands. Within seconds, the entire arena stood, not cheering, not screaming, simply applauding. Slowly, respectfully. The sound rolled across the stadium like gentle rain. It wasn't for a performance. It wasn't for fame. It was for a promise that had survived decades. Elvis wiped his eyes. He walked toward the microphone. For a long moment, he simply looked across the sea of faces. Then he smiled. Not the smile from magazine covers, not the smile perfected for cameras. A smaller smile, a quieter one. The smile of a man who had finally laid down a burden he had carried for far too long. I came here tonight to sing for you. He paused. But before I sing, he looked toward Emily. I want every person in this room to remember something. His voice echoed through every corner of the arena. Success is measured by applause. He gently held up Daniel's dog tag. But character is measured by the promises you keep when nobody is watching. No one spoke. No one moved. Then Elvis looked toward the orchestra. For the first time that night, he nodded. The pianist touched the keys, softly. A single melody drifted through the arena. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because every person in that room already understood the song before the first lyric was ever sung. Emily returned to her seat. This time, she wasn't carrying her father's burden. She was carrying his peace. And somewhere beyond memory, beyond time, beyond fame, two young soldiers seemed to laugh together once again beneath a cold, foreign sky. One remembered for changing music. The other remembered because he changed a man. Years later, many people would say that they had attended Elvis Presley's greatest concert. Not because he hit every note, not because the lights were brighter, not because the applause was louder. They remembered it because, for one unforgettable night, the greatest voice in the room was not the one that sang. It was the quiet voice of loyalty, the courage to forgive, and a promise that refused to die. When the final song ended, the audience rose together in one endless standing ovation. Some smiled, many cried. But every person left that arena carrying the same lesson. Legends are remembered for their talent. Greatness is remembered for the lives it touches when the spotlight fades. And on that extraordinary night in Las Vegas, people did not simply witness a concert. They witnessed a heart finally come home.